Okay, this is chapter 6 of Gender, Ideas, Interactions, Institutions, looking at men and masculinities. So men and women are both forced by society to do gender, but the consequences and benefits of gender are not symmetrical. That is because gender binary, it's hierarchical. So the hierarchy places men above women and values representations of masculinity above representations of femininity. So this narrows the range of life experiences that seem acceptable and right in the culture. So this also means that women routinely are positioned as helpers or caretakers to men, while they're positioned as protectors and breadwinners to women. So for women more than men, it results in a reduced social status, lower financial rewards, and an expectation that men's needs and interests should take priority over their own. So a great example of the gender hierarchy is the cheerleading example from the book, where they discuss the gender of cheerleading. So when you look at the history, cheerleading began in the mid-1800s as an all-male sport. It was considered equivalent in prestige to football. Being a cheerleader was a great responsibility and a high honor. In 1927, cheerleading manuals still referred to readers by exclusively male terms. So male cheer squads had prestige and were seen as leaders. Its athletes were projected to, have force and grace. So the idea of women being involved in the sport of cheerleading was ridiculous, as cheerleading was considered too masculine a sport for women to participate in. So when we look at gender in cheering, women were first allowed to join cheerleading squads when large numbers of young men went to fight in World War I. This left openings in those positions that women filled. So the entrance of women into the activity of cheerleading was considered unnatural and even inappropriate. When men returned from World War I, there was an effort to end women's cheerleading, with some schools banning female cheerleaders completely. But by the 60s and 70s, cheerleaders became primarily female, and the activity became less about leadership and strength and more about support and sexiness. So this increasing feminization of cheering changed the level of respect and seriousness for the activity. So it's a good kind of, example of how when things are in this androcentric system, when things are considered masculine, they're considered good. But once something's considered feminine, it loses status and it's considered not as good anymore. So this kind of demotion of cheering took place. Instead of changing the way we thought about women, the presence of women in cheerleading changed the way we thought about cheerleading. We trivialize it now, right? Cheerleading evolved from a respected pursuit to a silly sideshow on the sidelines. So as professions and activities became more female, the value of those professions started to decline. So the demotion of professions or activities as it undergoes a sex change is common. So understanding these demotions requires that we understand the relationship between gender and power. So it's interesting how in early years of cheerleading, it was considered a sport, and now it's not considered a sport, largely because of who it's associated with. So patriarchal power. When we talk about patriarchal power, we're talking about patriarchy. This is literally translated as rule by the father. But this refers to the control of female and younger male family members by select adult men. So the patriarch is the king of his castle. So his word becomes law at home. Historically, in a patriarchal society, men own all property, including the bodies of their wives and children, and any earnings or inheritance they might have. Well into the 1900s, many European and American societies operated with patriarchs in which women and children had zero rights. A patriarch may have social and legal permission to punish his wife or his children physically, brutally if he chose to. So this idea of the kind of king of the castle has a very violent undercurrent to it, because again, any hierarchy that's asymmetrical, where there's someone that has a lot of power at the top and they can't be questioned, leads to an opportunity for violence. So when we look at patriarchy then in the past, in patriarchal societies, women couldn't vote, they couldn't serve on juries or use birth control, they couldn't work after marriage, or even keep their own wages. And again, all of these things also apply to the history of the United States, right? That women couldn't attain a divorce or have custody of their children. They couldn't enlist in the military or own property. They couldn't hold political office or sue for discrimination, among many other restrictions. So men alone have legal and civil rights in a patriarchal society. Only men are entitled to act freely in the outside world, where they may or may not choose to represent the interests of their wives and children. So life was really like this for a long time, at least in the Western world. But as democracies replaced monarchies, the relationship among citizens changed. It changed first among men, but eventually women's freedoms expanded as well. So we get to this kind of democratic brotherhood, where patriarchy was slowly replaced with what they call democratic brotherhood, which involves the distribution of citizen rights to elite classes of men. So as poor men and men of color and immigrants and indigenous men fought for and gained rights of citizenship that elite men had in those early democracies, the brotherhood grew. So women also struggled and fought to gradually receive the rights of personhood. Although patriarchy has steadily declined as a principle of law, its underlying way of thinking about gender is still incredibly persistent. It's made its way into the operation and organization of our social institutions, so it has a staying power. Only gradually, in struggle after struggle, did they see victories or earning hard-fought rights one at a time. According to law, only a natural person or legal personality has rights, protections, privileges, responsibilities, and legal liability. So being seen as a full person in American society, for example, took a lot of years of struggle and work for people that were not white, wealthy, and male. So looking at patriarchy today, even though people no longer need to be male to count as a full citizen, men continue to be the generic human, with women as deviant from the norm. So patriarchal thinking persists in this continued equation of power with masculinity. So women's struggles have changed laws and customs so that today most Western countries are based on formal gender equality, or the requirement that laws should treat men and women as equal citizens, though we know that's not what actually often ends up playing out as such. And largely this is due to modified patriarchy. So this is often where if men are hegemonic, if men are the default category, then their men's identity becomes invisible, even to themselves, while women's identity as women is centrally important, right? Because we're othering women. So all too often, men are people and women are women. So one sign that we still live in a modified patriarchy is a persistent centering of men as normal or neutral, and the marginalizing of women as a modified, non-neutral type of person. So think about some of the ways that we do this, right? Some of the ways that we kind of default men as the norm in our culture. I mean, language is a very important part of this. I was part of that first generation of children exposed to like the second wave changes that they tried to affect the way that we see gender in society, specifically for occupation. So for example, if I say policeman, right, you have a particular limiting gendered characteristic, but if I say police officer, right, there's an opportunity for women to fit within that role. Though, of course, if you close your eyes and you picture police officer, you're still probably thinking of a man. In the same way you're thinking firefighter instead of fireman, or postal worker instead of mailman, or any of these kind of terms that have been slightly changed to a more gender neutral frame, largely that way so that people could see themselves within those realms. But as it has opened up our understandings for those roles a little bit, because the linguistic barriers to understanding things, it still hasn't largely changed the dynamics of patriarchy and how this operates in our culture. And so the chapter talks about relations of inequality, first being sexism. This is just the favoring of male-bodied over female-bodied people, both ideologically and in practice. Androcentrism is gender-based prejudice that favors whatever's seen as masculine compared to what's seen as feminine. So what makes that different? Androcentrism can be something as silly as like a style of clothing or a kind of food or even like a particular choice of pet because it's considered masculine and not feminine. Subordination is just the placing of women into positions that make them subservient or dependent on men. Our legacy of patriarchal gender relations tilts people's preferences towards men. And so this puts a thumb in the scale in the favor of male-bodied people, and this is reproduced in so many of our interactions every day. So language is important. Language affects meanings. It's a powerful influence on us, and it dictates what words we even have to describe things, which obviously affects the kind of understandings we can have from those meanings. So when you look at synonyms for the word power, they include words like male, manlike, manly, or masculine. Synonyms for the word weakness include effeminate, emasculate, and womanly. Likewise, the word femininity is said to be synonymous with docility, delicacy, softness, whereas masculinity is synonyms with courageous, hardy, muscular, potent, robust, strong, and vigorous. So even the terms themselves have a very gender connotation. And so it makes its way into the language, which affects the way that we see and understand the world and how we interact with each other. So gender is a metaphor for power. The associations reveal that gender really stands in for that power hierarchy that we have in the culture. So to be seen as less masculine is to be seen as less powerful, even feminine. Conversely, to be powerful is to represent masculinity. So when we tell someone to stop being weak, we tell them to man up, right? This is my favorite example actually, of how word meanings factor in. What is the word called when someone has erectile dysfunction and can't perform sexually? It's impotence. What is the literal translation of impotence? Loss of power. So clearly connecting sexual ability to literal power is what's happening within our language itself. So of course that affects the way that we understand the world and shapes our meanings for us through the language and the exchange of language we have with others. When it comes to gendered media representations, media largely centers on men and largely marginalizes women. A study of the top-grossing 200 non-animated films in 2015 found that only 17% of them were headlined by women that did not have a male co-lead. When it comes to screen time for male characters received almost twice as much screen time as women and had more than twice as many lines. And there's a figure in the book that also explores speaking roles in Best Picture films, finding that even when women are in the film themselves, they consistently say less than male characters. So this kind of leads to the Bechdel test. Bechdel test basically asks that 3 questions be used to evaluate all movies. The first one, are there 2 females in the movie that have names? Second question, do they speak to each other in at least one scene? And third question, do they speak to each other about something other than a man? Even when playing named female characters in a movie, the actresses tend to have less screen time than the actors unless they are the star. And even in these situations, when they do talk to another woman, they're always talking about a man. So think about rom-coms as an example, right? They might star or situate a female, but the whole goal is her getting married, her having a kid, or, some sort of relationship-y crap. And the whole movie centers around this man. So really, it's a story about a woman interested in a man, not as much a story about a woman. So it's interesting how almost every film that hits the box office does not meet the Bechdel test. And the Bechdel test is not like a feminist metric. It's not like if a movie is like good or has, representations of gender equality. It's just that it actually has 2 female named characters that talk to each other about something other than man. And you'd be surprised by how many films that we watch and love do not fit that criteria. When it comes to experiences of and social definitions of gender for men, the parent's negative reaction to boys' feminine side is a strong influence on masculine development. So this reflects androcentrism and the stigmatizing nature of femininity for men. Some studies in the early 2000s found that parents were concerned that feminine interests and behaviors in boys were inappropriate and worried that it suggested something was wrong with their son. Even parents who were tolerant of gender deviance sought to protect their sons from social disapproval by discouraging the public display of behavior that was associated with femininity. So this research was conducted in the early 2000s, so it suggests that today's young men were socialized in ways that discouraged interests, behaviors, or emotional displays that were considered feminizing. So younger people and women are more supportive of cross-gender play than older people and men, but regardless of the data, people tend to feel more comfortable when girls do it than when boys do. Because of androcentrism, anything a woman does can become off limits for men, which limits and constrains men's exploration of their inner lives and their creative and caretaking choices. right? They're told all sorts of things are just completely cut off to them, because if they perform them or do them or even think them, that opens them up for ridicule and really for being pushed down the social hierarchy. So many slurs for boys, if they're deemed feminine in any way, there's a lot of terms that are used to denigrate them. And the terms reflect sexist and androcentric world, telling boys and girls that being feminine, makes you a girl, and that being a girl is worse than being a boy or a man. So because of the social lessons that boys receive, they learn to avoid femininity. Boys who seem in any way feminine find themselves at the brunt of a lot of slurs, as I was just saying, like sissy, soft, all sorts of... A lot of the slurs themselves are connected to either homophobic slurs or misogynistic slurs. So basically saying that someone is not heterosexual or not masculine. And it's, again, the social hierarchies at play. It's basically telling someone you're falling down the social hierarchy. You're lower on that social hierarchy. So this gender policing just reflects a sexist and androcentric world. So many of the slurs that boys are facing are related to homosexuality. And these are slurs that stigmatize men for performing femininity. It sends a consistent message and emphasizes a rule designed to guide men behavior. Don't act like a girl. So again, we know there's a lot of slurs related to homosexuality. So for example, C.J. Pascoe wrote a book called Dude, You're a Fag that explored these peer group interactions of teen males, talking about the relationship between the slurs and the opinions of, kind of heteronormativity. So in this experience, being gay is incidental, since any man or boy who is perceived to be feminine attracts the slur. In fact, studies have shown that boys and men avoid calling known homosexuals by those terms, even when they otherwise liberally use that language with heterosexuals. So in C.J. Pascoe's ethnography, she found this as well. She found that the accusations of homosexuality are really just forms of gender policing, a way to force men to perform a certain way to avoid ridicule and, the potential for violence. So male flight is another interesting phenomenon they discuss in the chapter. This is where men abandon feminized areas of life, because as we know, becoming feminized or being associated with femininity can have social consequences. So it makes sense that when men feel that women are encroaching in that space, they leave. So male flight accelerates a trend towards feminization, and this quickly ramps up the pace at which a given domain starts to become inappropriate for men. But the problem with this too is it's not just about network TV, which is a big one, male, especially white male flight from network television, where you see these kind of sitcom dramas that have a lot of representation of women and people of color and these different representations. As you see those representations increase, you see white men leaving the audience, right? So this isn't just TV though, right? This is like valuable areas that men will flee, like education, because they want to avoid any feminine stigma. So as girls and women have come to excel in school, and now women are outpacing men in bachelor's degree earning, boys and men have increasingly associated education with femininity. So women are now outperforming men at all levels of schooling. And underachievement is seen as cool for men, especially if they pretend not to care, right? Because caring is like the worst thing you can do. Why? Because it's feminine. So it's just a trap. It's a trap for men, right? Because they become less interested in education than women, especially if they've internalized the rules of masculinity, even though education benefits everybody and gives us all a leg up and a better way to understand the world, right? Education's like a necessity. It's not something that should be a commodity like it is in our capitalist society. It should be something that people do regardless of their level of where they're at in their life, their entire lives. Because if we're not continuously learning, then what are we doing, right? But this is problematic for not just like in situations like cheerleading or network television, but leaving education because it's considered feminine. Think about the long-term social consequences that has for many men. So hegemony has a lot to do with this. So the definition of hegemony just refers to a state of collective consent to inequality that's secured by the idea that it's inevitable, right? It's natural, it's desirable, that it's just gonna be that way. It's like the dominant way. So hegemony just means the widespread consent to relations of systematic social disadvantage, right? So in our culture, we have this very strong notion of hegemonic masculinity. So this just means the type of masculine performance that's idealized by men and women alike that functions to justify and naturalize gender inequality. So anytime in society where there's an inequality, there's always an ideology to justify it, because largely if you have the ideology and you believe it, then you don't have to change anything, right? But if you acknowledge the reality of life and you actually have to change stuff, that takes a lot more work. So it's a lot easier to just say, like for example, let's say poverty, right? We have large issues of structural poverty that has to do with generations of inequality, of financial inequality, of racial inequality, of situations of globalization. But instead we'll just say, well, the poor are lazy, they just don't work hard enough, right? And by saying a stupid thing like that, you then just justify the inequality as you see it and say, well, it's inevitable. There's nothing we could do to change it. Let's not tax billionaires, right? so then the problem continues. So the same thing happens when it comes to hegemonic masculinity, right? We just assume that this idea that men are murdering people and killing themselves at epidemic rates, that's just normal, that's natural, right? Or the crisis of, the violence that in our culture that comes from the hands of men. It's like, well, it's just testosterone. It's just normal, right? Which of course we know that's not how testosterone works. Testosterone has a permissive effect. So it's actually more the effect of when you're in an aggressive situation, your testosterone goes up, just as hormone levels vary based on your experiences and like what situation you're in. But anyway, right? We just use these things as a way to excuse everything for what it is right now and not have to look critically at anything and say, everything's fine. Just keep moving along, right? Knowing full well that everything is not fine. So, hegemonic masculinity just means that it's a social disadvantage to women and of course to a lot of men too, because this idea of everyone looking like Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson is just not physically possible for many men, especially because of the kind of social class considerations of to not work but like be at the gym all the damn time or have a nutritionist or any of these kind of things that people have to do to get in like Marvel movie shape. It's just not accessible to the common man, right? And if we're equating everything with masculinity about financial achievement, about physical prowess, about sexual prowess, that's not going to leave the door open for a lot of men to kind of find their way into that hierarchy. So, the practice of hegemonic masculinity creates this idea of a real man in our collective imagination. And this real man, quote unquote, theoretically embodies all the positive traits of masculinity, or that side of the gender binary that we're trying to kind of differentiate from women. So not all men have or want those traits, but by membership in the category, they get to identify with the characteristics that we attribute to men in general. So all men can lay a socially valid claim to advantage by the virtue of traits that are attributed to their sex, but not every man is going to be hegemonic, right? Because the hegemonic man, who is he? What does he look like? What's his race? What's his height? What's his social class? What kind of car does he drive? Right? We have these notions because they come from advertising. They come from TV film industry. They come from celebrity culture that tell us what a man should be in our culture. And it's very narrow definition. And it doesn't really allow men, especially men of color, poor men, queer men, trans men, or just men that have in any way are marginalized to really see themselves represented positively in the culture. So there's also these problems, really, when you have extreme conformity to anything, that's a problem, but extreme conformity is really glorified in our culture. And when it comes to extreme conformity to masculinity, this just means the more aggressive you are, the more hyper-masculine you are, the more you're glorified in many corners of our culture, more rewarded socially. So we see many examples of hyper-masculine performances, right? By some athletes, actors, pretty much every action movie that's ever been made, right? Musicians. And these performances naturalize male violence, aggression, and anger. So for me, my favorite part of this is I love action movies. I came up growing up, I have a brother that's 7 years older than me. So I watched like a lot of action movies that I probably shouldn't have watched at a young age in retrospect. And it definitely cast for me this idea of the hegemonic man, right? Like Schwarzenegger, or, this kind of like Predator, kind of, Rambo kind of archetypes. And what's interesting is they're all very much the same, right? They have a very narrow definition of, what's acceptable and how they can act and what it is that they do that gets them the attention. And often there's like a female love interest involved, largely because when you remove the love interest from some of these movies, they become much more homoerotic. So anyway, it's really interesting though that like the actors themselves are people who are like not hard, right? Just want to put that out there. Like these are people, well, I mean, sure, I'm sure some actors, they get really, into their character and they go hard at stuff, but most actors are very wealthy. They sit in their trailer for many hours of the day. They're pampered in makeup and hair. They, have the best of situations. And then they walk out there and pretend to be a tough guy for an hour and get paid a bunch of money. And then people take that pretending to be a tough guy image as what it is, right? Like people often do this with like Fight Club, like a Tyler Durden kind of thing. When you're like, Brad Pitt is not Tyler Durden by a long shot. He just like knew how to play a role in a film. And so it's funny, it's like, we know these are actors, we know these are fake, yet we still believe the message that comes from these things, that that's what men should be like. And this isn't just for men, this is for women too. So this affects the way that men interact with women, largely because, women have those expectations as well. So we're all being socialized and kind of brainwashed through this, hegemonic masculinity to really want more hyper-masculine performances. So we share a lot of cultural messages that suggest that men are naturally more angry, aggressive, and violent. But again, those behaviors are no more natural for men than for women. Men have to be trained to resist the sensation of empathy, right? They have to be told not to cry. They have to be encouraged to enter dangerous situations enthusiastically. All of this is part of the rules of masculinity. It's not natural, it's not normal. It has everything to do with how we all grow up in this culture. So men are not naturally violent. Despite the prevalence of hypermasculinity, men are not naturally violent. And even when we talk about the incidence of male violence in our culture, which is prevalent, largely, a lot of the time, this isn't every man. This is like people that are committing violence over and over and over and just not being held accountable for it. Oftentimes, that's what's, creating a lot of the problems. Like, for instance, when we talk about sexual assault, a lot of the perpetrators are these kind of repeat offenders, right? And then you also have the situation in which some of the offenders are just, date rapists. Like 70% of the time, a woman is going to be raped by someone she knows, a friend, a family, colleague, or a family friend, or, maybe even a family member. And so this becomes a situation where it's much more complicated than some man in the bushes jumping out to get you. So this idea, though, that we justify rape because we live in a rape culture, which we'll talk about in the next chapter. But, we justify this idea that, well, women just weren't protecting themselves enough. Why? Because we see it as, well, men are just sexually aggressive, so therefore they can't help themselves. They're just beasts with no brain, which I vehemently disagree with. I think that's incredibly sexist to reduce men to not being able to control themselves, because they totally can, right? Like, look at Bill Cosby or something like that. Again, we'll talk about this a little bit more in chapter 7, but this wasn't some brute force situation. Like, he was manipulative. He knew exactly what he was doing. He had a whole infrastructure of people around him that would help him commit all of these assaults. So we see that it's often not just that one offender. It's all the people around them that allow it to happen. But when you think about it, we say that 1 in 3 women is sexually assaulted. That doesn't mean 1 in 3 men are rapists, right? The stats don't match in that direction. It's more so that there's a lot more of those kind of Bill Cosbys out there that are committing serial cases of assault over and over and over, but just never being held accountable, largely because they have power, right? He leveraged his power as a star. The fact that people wouldn't believe that that's what happened. And what happened when the first woman came out against Bill Cosby? What happened? Everyone said, oh, that's terrible, and we totally believe you. No, of course not. She was vilified. They were like, oh, she just wants 15 minutes of fame. Who wants 15 minutes of fame for being raped? Nobody ever in history. So that's just such a weird argument. But then what happened? Now there's like over 60 plus women have come out against Bill Cosby. Are they going back and retroactively saying, oh, I'm so sorry, we were wrong about this person? Of course not. That's not how media works. That's not how any of it works. But it's interesting that, once you get to a certain point, we realize, like, oh, wow, no, there's a lot of evidence there. But why didn't we believe it when there was one person saying it, right? Why didn't we believe it when it was 10 people saying it? It's just, it takes so much to push back against these serial assaulters and serial rapists when it should be kind of cut and dry and obvious to the rest of us that like we should put these people behind bars because they keep hurting people over and over and over and over, right? So the problem though is if our culture says men are naturally violent, men are naturally hyper-aggressive and hypersexual, then it justifies these really creepy creepers that actually do this awful stuff because they say, well, that's just natural. And you're like, no, it's not, or every man would be doing it. And they're not. Okay, so when it comes to dangers of masculinity, there's also a lot of harm to self. So, taking masculinity to the extreme makes, basically putting yourself in dangerous situations more common. And sometimes it's not just, being harming others, but also harming themselves, right? We have this horrible gun violence epidemic, and a big part of it is men killing themselves, right? Every single day across the US, you lose so many men who, basically turn the bullet inward. And so that's a huge part of the harm to self, but another huge part of it is disregarding safety. So men are significantly more likely than women to disregard their own safety. Especially compared to women, men will participate in more risky behaviors or work more physically dangerous jobs. And in general, they tend to take less care of their health. So this relates to toxic masculinity. So this is a term that refers to the strategic enactments of masculinity that are harmful to both men who enact them and the people around them. So while the hegemonic ideal is not the same as toxic versions that are drawn from it, some of men's efforts to live up to the ideal can be extremely harmful. So especially when it comes to harming others, men are more likely than women to commit acts of violence. Men account for the majority of crimes committed, when it comes to murder, non-negligent manslaughter and rape. And even to things like drug abuse violations and driving under the influence, right? They're less safe, so that often leads to harming others as well. So the gendered nature of violence, it often remains invisible because we tend to accept that men are naturally violent. So this is why there's a Jackson Katz video and the additional resources that explores this a little bit further, where he talks about, the relationship of the media coverage of how we understand masculinity and the fact that we never look at gender as a factor. Because when you have a hegemonic group like masculine, in a patriarchal culture, masculine becomes the default category. So it just becomes unobserved and it becomes default. So we just think of men as normal. And then we think of women or anyone that's not binary or trans as somehow other, right? But men are just normal. So in Jackson Katz's video, he explores this further and links it to issues of, some, school shootings and other kind of high profile issues of violence. So also when it comes to hate groups, men are much more likely to join hate groups. And research on this subject reveals that many men aren't drawn to the hateful ideology so much itself. It's more that they have the promise of a connection to other masculine men. It's basically like a boys' club to hang out in that draws a lot of men in because they don't have the ability to kind of make those social networks in the same way that women do, right? We allow women to have much more kind of close relationships with other women. But for men, it can be very difficult to create those kind of brotherhoods, especially if you're looking specifically for a specific kind of hegemonic masculinity. Then a hate group, you might find it there, right? Because a lot of people are blustering about their masculinity to convince each other that they're all tough. Okay, so when it comes to patriarchal bargains, men make strategic choices. Sometimes they have to choose between following the rules or being seen as a failure. At other times, masculine privilege may feel like the only kind of advantage that they have. So patriarchal bargain, has to do with, the hierarchy of masculinity, where men will make a patriarchal bargain, which are deals in which an individual or group accepts or even legitimizes some cost of patriarchy in exchange for receiving some of its rewards. So men may also think the costs of getting too close to femininity are too high. So masculinity is one of the things that makes men feel good about themselves, but it can also be a substantial form of oppression, because in many ways it hurts men. So can masculinity be good? Sure, right? When we look at finding new ways of being men, in America today, some men are actively trying to find different ways that don't uphold patriarchy, reward hypermasculinity, or oppress women or other men. And so, hypermasculinities are coming about as these men are inventing and adopting those new identities or new versions of masculinity that selectively incorporate symbols, performances, and identities that society associates with women or low-status men. But many men try to stay in control, conquer, call the shots, right? Tough it out, all those kind of verbal linguistic ways that we reinforce masculinity, right? But oftentimes, if you're in a hybrid masculinity, you're also going to be repressing certain things about themselves that conflict with hegemonic masculinity. So hybrid masculinities can potentially undermine the importance of gender distinction, give femininity more value in the culture, de-gender some of the hierarchical relationships, and deconstruct the hierarchy of masculinity completely. Men sometimes find the rules of masculinity to be strict, arbitrary, and even painful. Like, oh, I can't wear this color. I can't, express like love for someone or hug them or cry. I mean, that's a incredibly restrictive way to live one's life, is to not be able to show or express an emotion without there being potential social consequences. So many men, are not going to follow those rules anymore. They're just going to break the rules. They're going to act how they want to act, and they're going to do things that vary from those traditional performances of the past. But as we've seen, gender is socially constructed. So we can change it. We can change notions of it over time. So many men, though, will follow the gender rules and press others to do so, because if they uphold the hierarchical gender binary, that means that they can preserve the privileges that come with being male. So if we were able to excise masculinity from the dominating toxic and compensatory behaviors, alongside all the other bad things of being afraid to express your emotions and all that fun stuff, then what's left is a series of great traits that are like good things that everyone should have, right? Like duty, honor, hard work, sacrifice, leadership, right? All of those things are good. So yes, masculinity can be good. It's just we have to excise a lot of those ways in which we're just upholding a hierarchical gender binary, and in order to preserve privileges that come along with maleness, such as subordination of women and, more social advantages. So that's, kind of the rub basically here is, can it be good? Yeah, we can create new ways of understanding this, of course. Sometimes people get very weird about any sort of change in gender dynamics as if it's always been one way, but it always changes with every generation. It's super normal for it to change. But oftentimes we think it's, inevitable or unending because we have these weird biological notions of how gender works. So once we understand that it has everything to do with our social construction, then we can see that we can push back. We can either accept the way that things are and act in that way, or we can push back and create new ways and new forms of masculinity that gives more men opportunity to have more expression and not feel completely constrained by the limits of masculinity or what is considered masculinity within our culture.